Everyone, welcome to the book launch of Filipino American Psychology, second edition. My name is Kevin Nadal. Thank you so much for being here. I'm so honored to be able to share some of my thoughts and insights about the newest edition of this book. I am so honored to be joined by my friends, my kababayan, my comadre, compadre, Dr. Allyson Tintiangco-Cubales and Dr. EJ David to share in this experience. And so, what I wanted just to do first is just to tell you a little bit about the book, its conceptualizations, as well as like what it was like for this book to have its second edition. So, to make a long story short, I first wrote this book in 2009. I just finished up with my PhD in counseling psychology from Columbia University, and it was essentially part of my dissertation, my literature review for my dissertation, and I added a few more chapters. And one of the reasons why I did it was because at that point there was really no textbook that was a comprehensive look at Filipino American mental health issues and psychological experiences in the United States. Up until that point, there have been a lot of great scholars who had written about things that were related, but not necessarily on Filipino Americans. So for example, there was great work on Filipino psychology or psychology of people living in the Philippines or Philippine citizens, Filipino people in the Philippines, first initially conceptualized by Dr. Virgilio Enriquez. There was a lot of work on Filipino Americans and certain types of certain variables, certain issues. So people like Dr. Maria Root, she wrote a book called Filipino Americans Transformation and Identity. She also wrote about multiracial issues. She also wrote about like clinical issues and working with Asian Americans, Filipinos. There were people like Dr. Alvin Alvarez, who wrote about racism, Dr. Linda Revilla, who wrote about ethnic identity, so many others, Sionia Asuncion, Dr. Ping Serafica, and so many others who did a lot of great work. But I really wanted there to be some sort of comprehensive work on Filipino Americans. And so I started to write this book. It was something that was a labor of love. It was something that I never knew would be published. It was something that took a lot of rejections in order for it to happen. And so when the book came out, it was also around the time that Filipino American psychology started to form and started to take off as its own field within the greater field of psychology and Asian American psychology, and even within the greater field of Filipino American studies. And so I have my friend, my brother, Dr. EJR David, to thank for that as well. Together, we were on a mission to write about Filipino American issues. And so together, we were writing about different things. I started writing about ethnic identity. EJ started writing about colonial mentality. We joined forces. We helped to co-found the Asian American Psychological Association's division on Filipino Americans, which is now in its 11th year or 12th year, something like that. And I was fortunate enough to go on a national and international book tour with the first edition. I went to places like California and Washington and Chicago and Hawaii and everywhere. I even went to London, which was interesting because then I got to talk about Filipino American psychology with Filipino British folks, and even to Canada. So I talked to Filipino Canadians as well. And so, the book has really just taken off in a way I never really knew it would. It did pretty well. That in addition to the formation of this division on Filipino Americans, we saw a lot of research on Filipino Americans take off, and specific to psychology. When I first wrote the book, there were a lot of places where there wasn't a lot written on certain topics. And some of it was even just me kind of hypothesizing or writing based on what my own lived experience was, and not necessarily based on what I had empirical research to back me up on. And so today I want to just talk not just about the book, but also just about Filipino American psychology in general. And so I've invited my two friends here to share some of their perspectives, two of the most brilliant people I've ever met, two of the leading scholars of Filipinx American studies. And so I want to just ask you all about some of your thoughts on the growth of Filipinx American studies and Filipino American psychology in the past decade. So who wants to start? I'm open. Let's start with Dr. David. You want to go to first? Okay. So EJ, thoughts about just Filipino American psychology and tell them your perspective. How did we get here? And where are some of the ways that, or where are some of the directions that we can go?
Yeah, well, first of all, congratulations, for the second edition of this book. I am familiar with the history of the book, and I understand you kind of alluded to it a little bit. It was hard to publish, a book that is Filipino American specific. Um, way back in the 2000s, as if that was such a long time ago. But as recently as the 2000s, it was very difficult to publish a Filipino American specific book, because publishers just felt like there was not enough audience out there for it. So regardless of how rigorous it might be, or how well written it might be, or regardless of how important the publishers believe the topic might be, they feel like it's not going to sell. So I understand the hustle that it probably took for you to get the book out there, and to prove to publishers that there is an audience out there, that the community is hungry for it. And so for something like this, or something that started the way that this book started, which is full of rejections, and then now it's in its second edition, I think it's an accomplishment, so congratulations
Thank you.
for that. So my thoughts, psychology, we have Allyson here, to think a lot, Allyson and ethnic studies, and really other fields, to think, because as you know, Kev, when you and I in psychology, when we started, there's not a whole lot on Filipino Americans, and we had to depend a lot on literature from other fields, um, to kind of extrapolate what we can use in psychology. And so, yeah, so I think we have really a big debt, toward ethnic studies and other fields like education and social work, even, that really informed psychology for us, as we were trying to build it. Um, because psychology was really behind other fields, if I remember correctly. And but to me, that speaks to, I think, how strong Filipino American psychology is now, or at least how strong the foundation of Filipino American psychology is now, because right from the beginning, it has ethnic studies roots, and it has multidisciplinary roots. And so, so whatever it is now, whatever Filipino American psychology is now, I think should still reflect those roots.
Mhm.
And yeah, so again, I think your book, you mentioned 2009, when the first book came out. um I did a little bit of I'm a data guy, and so I did a little bit of like a literature search, before this meeting today. And I looked at how much literature was out there in PsycInfo, which is the largest database of psychology related works there is, before 2009, 2010. And there were about 500 hits, and that's like from like 1900 all the way to
Yeah.
2009, which is what, like 110 years or so.
Yeah.
Right. And then I did one from 2010 to today,
Yeah.
and there's about like 350.
Wow.
And so we pretty much, since the publication of of your book um, in 2009, we pretty much matched, the number of literature, you know,
Mhm.
during the 110 years prior to that, and I think it's not a coincidence, that your book, happened like around that time, 2009, 2010. It has contributed to really the rapid growth of Filipino American psychology, because I think, um, it gave us, the book Filipino American Psychology gave us visibility, a lot of visibility actually. And the book itself, it became like a physical manifestation, right, of this field, of this subfield.
Mhm.
And so yeah, it made us, those of us who have been interested in Filipino American psychology for a very long time, it made us feel like, so formal now, where it made us feel so
Mhm.
official. It made us feel validated. And so I think it gave us confidence, and it gave us fuel to continue pursuing this area. So props to you.
Yeah,
I'll,
no, but props to you too, because your book came out right after that, and and you had also written so much around that time, more than you know, we'd ever seen in that short amount of time, from like 2006, I think was your first article, co-authored with Dr. Okazaki on colonial mentality, to about like 2010. You had a lot of really high impact articles, as well as the release of your book, first called Filipino American Postcolonial Psychology, and then later Brown Skin, White Minds. Um, so I think you as well, you reminded me that I forgot to shout out a couple people in my little list of elders off the top of my head, but Dr. Lenny Strobel, and her work on decolonization, coming full circle, like that was a huge influence, that led to us being able to write, as well as social workers like Amy Agbiani, and other folks who definitely wrote about our issues as well. But I thank you also for acknowledging ethnic studies, and so maybe this is a perfect segue to talk to Allyson. And ethnic studies has been around for the past 50 years, and Filipino American studies has been around for a while, but psychology has been far behind. And so I'd be curious to hear, from your perspective, Allyson, already an established tenured professor by the time the book came out, what was it like seeing like, oh, the psychology stuff has popped in, and how were you able to use that? Like, I know that your PEP, Pinay Pinoy Educational Partnerships, you all talk a lot about mental health now, and I know that you've done a lot of great work on wellness and schools. So be so happy to hear some of your perspectives too.
Oh, Kevin. EJ, I first off, I just want to reiterate congratulations. Second edition of any book is a big deal. So I just want to say thank you for continuing the work. I think for some of us, we do some work and we're like, okay, that's it. But you continued to edit the book, add more things. What I'm hearing is I'm in the book somehow, so I'm excited about that, right? Um, but I want to pause and say thank you for acknowledging ethnic studies. I think in traditional fields like psychology, and I'm not a psychologist. I'm not a psychologist by training, but I do provide support that does require me to work on the mental health of our community. Um, but I want to say thank you for acknowledging ethnic studies. It is 50 years old, but thanks to the Black Student Union and the Third World Liberation Front in 1968 and 69, we're all able to do our work.
Mhm.
And so just to acknowledge, I'll begin before we talk about Filipinos, it's important to acknowledge all the work that has been done by the Black community, by the Indigenous community, by the Latino community, that allows us the opportunity to do work in the Asian American community, and then also for Filipinas, Filipinexes,
Mhm.
So I think that that's really important, to talk when we talk about the roots of Filipinx American psychology, that we really do look at the amazing work that has been done by people of color about people of color. And so I'll start there, like, because I think what's really important is to acknowledge that you are a Pinoy doing Pinoy work, and talking about Pinoy stuff. And that's really, really important because a lot of people were writing about us, but it wasn't us. And so to me, like, even beginning to understand the impact of your work and the impact of this particular text is to start off by saying, thank you for deciding to write about our community. As a person in our community, as a leader in our community, thank you for doing that work. And that's related to ethnic studies, because ethnic studies is all about the first person narrative. Like, it's so necessary for us to tell our own narratives and then to analyze our own narratives. I remember reading EJ's book and going, damn, that guy's hella smart. All saying all these like tools. Some stuff I couldn't understand. I'm just letting you know, EJ. I was like, I don't understand this tool, but let me think about this and what it means. Because I've been teaching about colonial mentality and about identity for quite some time. And your texts, both of your texts kind of came after curriculum that we'd already written. And so it was thinking about how to integrate a more nuanced text around psychology from both of you into the ways in which we understand identity. Because identity has been so central to ethnic studies and so central to Filipinx American studies that your text fell into the understanding of how does identity matter? How is it constructed? Right? Like, how is it and how is it generational? And also really important is, what is our process of understanding who we are and how does that impact the way we understand our well-being? And so that's kind of how my work kind of fits into all of this, is really thinking about the ways that you all have talked about psychology and the trauma that we've experienced, and how that impacts how we understand ourselves. And so when I'm thinking about PEP and I'm thinking about working with youth, it's important for us, or us teachers, to understand what they've experienced and how they shape their understanding of their identity, which is very much psychological, right? Not to mention how the social impacts the psychology of it. And so I often think of when I'm thinking of using your text, and in my identity class, they read both of your work at the beginning of the semester. It allows me the opportunity to kind of have a segue, like to really open up the door and say, our experiences are important. Our people are writing about our experiences, and they're describing them, in these ways. Right. And I feel like you both allowed for that, so I just want to say thank you back. Like, I know you thanked me for ethnic studies. I did not discover ethnic studies, by the way. But I've been teaching in there for a couple decades, so I will say you're welcome. But I do want to say thank you to both of you, for your work. I remember those initial stages. I was already teaching for like a decade. And then when the book came out, and I know you were on tour, I think both of us were touring around doing a bunch of different conferences and stuff. And I was like, who is this dude? I actually didn't know you yet, right? Like we were literally on
Even
stage
though we grew up
together.
in the same town. We grew up in the same town and didn't know each other.
Yep. I was like, who is this dude? Talk about psychology. And, mind you, like we'd already been using Lenny Strobel's text and Virgilio Enriquez's text, and really trying to understand it from those perspectives. And I mean, that was a decade ago, a little over a decade ago. And what I learned over the years was your ability, Kevin, to have an idea and realize it. So I'm kind of going off track on how about this specific text. And I just want to say thank you for doing that, and I know it has not been easy, but I feel like that contribution in your ability to really realize some of the things that we've dreamed of has been really important to the development of Filipino American studies. And so this text coming back, I'm excited. I will be honest to the audience, I haven't read the second edition. I have high hopes for the second edition. I know it's the first edition, like I remember there were some moments when I was like, oh, maybe you could have talked about this, maybe, but I'm hearing that those might be in the second edition. I'm really
Yep.
excited about that.
Yep.
So yeah, I'll stop there for now, but
Yeah.
again, this is more of a thank you for continuing the work.
Thank you. I mean, I want to like piggyback on two things that you said. One is to acknowledge the other communities of color that have come before us, because that's literally what my trajectory was. Like, I wasn't mentored by Filipino American mentors. I had Black mentors and I had Latinx mentors, specifically, Chicano, Chicanx mentors. My introduction to what we now call multicultural psychology or ethnic minority psychology was from taking Black psychology and taking, it was called Latino psychology back then, and later taking Asian American psychology. But the field of Asian American psychology really does exist because of the folks who had done all the amazing work with Black psychology first, Indigenous psychology, and Latinx psychology too. The other piece that like I want to acknowledge is, when I wrote the book in 2008, I was fresh out of my graduate program, and my graduate program in counseling psychology was probably way more social justice oriented than a traditional counseling psychology program, which some people might get mad at because they're like, no, we're the most social justice oriented. And you might be, but the thing is that regardless of how social justice oriented any psychology program is, it is likely not rooted in ethnic studies. It is likely rooted in traditional Western psychology. And so when I first wrote the book, like that's where I was coming from, was traditional psychology, which included traditional multicultural psychology, but didn't include ethnic studies. And so one thing, like I shared with you earlier, was I didn't cite Pinaism in the first 2009 edition because I had never learned about Pinaism in my classes, right? And so that's something that I hope this edition and also future editions will cover, is just, how can we merge all of these fields that are so important, instead of, for psychologists to think you have to go this fully traditional route, and then, as an afterthought, learn about ethnic studies. Like, why couldn't it have been, for me at least, integrated throughout my entire program? And I hope what we're doing now is that we're encouraging future generations, our current students, to recognize that you can go into any field and do that critical thinking. You can go into any field and do that critical learning and learn, the text of not just, Filipino, Filipinx American scholars, but other queer scholars, people of color, Black and Indigenous and other people of color scholars. And yes, you might have to learn some of the white mainstream literature as well to get through your program. But perhaps we can try to do both at the same time. So I'm really excited, because we also are collaborating on redefining what Filipino American studies is in general. And so the three of us together are co-editing the upcoming Sage Encyclopedia on Filipina XO American Studies. And so, I hope that in itself, the fact that we are interdisciplinary, we have an amazing editorial board of folks from all disciplines. We have, the different sections on things like history and humanities and education and health and so forth. I hope that's a step in the right direction. EJ, do you have any other thoughts?
Yeah, well, I just want to say I'm really excited about the encyclopedia project too, because I think that's, a community project. We have so many, contributions from so many different people. So I'm excited about that. But yeah, I mean, Filipino American psychology, I think we've grown a lot. We have, our roots really are influenced by the work of a lot of other communities of color, a lot of other scholars of color. Same thing with me. I mean, my book, Brown Skin, White Minds, that's an homage to what inspired it. Frantz Fanon, Black Skin, White Masks. The original title, Filipino American PostColonial Psychology, that was after Native American PostColonial Psychology, work by Eduardo and Bonnie Duran. So, I've learned a lot. I've brought in whatever I could find relevant to the Filipino American experience into Filipino American psychology. And so, sure, I agree. We have a lot of different communities and a lot of different disciplines to think for that. So, and then finally, as much as Filipino American psychology has grown, though, I think we can continue to get better. I think we definitely need a lot more Filipino American specific work to come out. The creation of the division of Filipino Americans within the Asian American Psychological Association, I think, is going to help, because now we have a large and growing community of people who will do Filipino American specific work. So that's great for us. And then, I think people also, it's gaining some traction now, finally, but I think people really need to start disaggregating data, Asian American data, and look at the specific ethnic groups within this large Asian American umbrella, because especially Filipino Americans, we have unique historical and contemporary experiences than other Asian American groups. And then one last thing that I really want to mention, and I think we need to do better in terms of trying to better integrate and incorporate and understand the different experiences of the different indigenous and cultural groups, even within the Filipino American umbrella. So I think that's definitely an area where we're lacking a lot right now, and so I think more improvement is needed there.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, Allyson, one of the things that I want to thank you for is creating this pipeline for Filipino American scholars and educators, not just professors who have come up. Literally, you've had so many students who have become tenured professors, but also for teachers and K through 12 teachers, and through PEP, and now creating their own curricula and teaching young Filipino American kids that they can go into education. So I want to thank you for that. I hope the trajectory of Filipino American psychologists and other clinical fields is increasing as well. I think that's something we can also try to work on. And I hope that if there are folks in other fields, that they can kind of take these two examples of Filipino Americans in education and higher education and K through 12 education and Filipino Americans in psychology, and realize that your fields can do this too. When people hear that we have like this division on Filipino American psychology, they're like, really? Like, how many sociologists are there? How many engineers are there? And how many, whatever field there is? And you can form that, right? There's caucuses of Filipino Americans across so many different organizations, but it just takes that one person to really start that. Hopefully two, so that there's a collective and you're, splitting the work. But that's one thing that I hope that we can do. Allyson, thoughts on your end?
I really hope that there is something like PEP for Filipino American psychologists. I think that that's actually a really important piece. Some of our PEP teachers have then become your students, and you two have mentored them, and we've been on dissertation committees. I mean, our goal is really to multiply. It is not. I've always been about not being the only one in the seat. I think that the three of us, when we work together, we really are able to support more and more students. So I'm really excited about that. In terms of the book, again, this is an amazing thing that, to have a second edition. I really hope when people pick up the book that they go into it with the goal of trying to find healing. I think that sometimes when we read academic texts, we're looking for anything. I mean, between like, trying to find, like citations and different, I feel like sometimes we approach it in this really maybe too academic way. I feel like going into the text, for those of you who are going to read this, like go into it thinking about how can this text support our possibilities of mending, becoming well, what kinds of things have I not even thought about yet, like that I now all of a sudden are thinking about. So I hope that when people approach the text, they're looking to find themselves in it. And I really believe in dialogue, like, so whatever this text brings in terms of dialogue, I'm hoping that the goal is really about what can we do to better heal in our community, and what can we do to actually figure out ways that we can support our health, our wellness, whether that be mental wellness, emotional wellness, or any kind of well-being. So I just want to thank you for now opening up new dialogue for us, because that will be what we do when we get the text, is really to have dialogue about our communities. So thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for that, that invitation for dialogue, because I think, one of the things that I really want to impart onto people is that I by no means think that this book is the most comprehensive book on Filipino American experiences. I know there's so much more that could be written on different things. And, in the same way that part of me felt like Filipino American experiences were missing from other texts, you might feel the same way about this text. And if that is the case, then I encourage you to write more. Maybe you have a voice or perspective that needs to be heard, that hasn't been written about yet. And in fact, that's part of the problem, or not problem, I should say. That's part of the challenge of me doing some of this work, is that I recognize that there's so much that hasn't been written about that I presume is something that should be written about. But if I don't have that knowledge or that expertise, if it hasn't been written about before, and I don't feel like I'm the one to write about it, then that becomes, a challenge. And so I hope that, we can all encourage others, and especially younger generations, to write more. And thank you so much for sharing the piece about, I hope folks can find some parts of themselves and heal. And that was really the impetus for this book, from first edition to even now, is to try to tell our story. Like, there's so much about being Filipina, Filipinx, Filipino American, that has generally either been completely misunderstood, or omitted altogether. Uncle Fred Cordova, founding president of the Filipino American National Historical Society, first referred to Filipinos as forgotten Asian Americans. And that was, over 30 years ago that he wrote that text. And in some ways, we're still forgotten. But we don't have to be forgotten anymore. We can write our stories, write our narratives from our own personal perspectives. We can do empirical research. We could do qualitative research. We could tell oral histories or do oral histories. We could do arts and poetry and spoken word. And these are all ways that we tell our stories. And so I hope that that's something that we all do. I just want to shout out a little bit about the book, Filipino American Psychology, second edition. In it, you'll find chapters on ethnic identity, colonial mentality, organizational psychology, so the ways that Filipino Americans might interact with each other in groups and in communities, a chapter on multiracial folks, a chapter on gender and sexuality, a chapter on or on adoptees, a chapter on mental health issues and stigmas towards mental health treatment, a chapter on various social cultural issues and some of the ways that Filipinx Americans have not been the model minority in this country, and a new section that I wrote in this book on historical trauma. So the ways that we have been holding on to, or trauma has been passed down through generations, and how it then manifests in us, in our current selves and in our current bodies. And so I hope that folks get a chance to read that. I hope that you can either purchase the book, or another thing, because I know that not everyone has the ability to purchase the book, ask your libraries to pick it up, especially if you live in a large Filipino American community. All you got to say is, we live in a large Filipino American neighborhood community. Can you pick up this book so that everyone can have it? And that would make me so happy, because then it would be a way that we can really give away this literature for free. It shouldn't be something that is hidden behind psych info or paywalls. I really want everyone to be able to have access to this book. So I'm going to end there, but I want to thank you both for not just doing the work and for inspiring me every single day, but just to thank you also for just being my friends and being people who support me and love me, and I love you all too. And I hope that there will be future generations of Filipino American scholars who love each other the same way that we all love each other, because we really have each other. And when you're the only voice at the table, or the only, Filipinx, Pinay, Pinoy person at the table, that could be a lot. So having each other is one of the ways that we can resist, and we can fight for our voices to be heard. And so I really thank you for that. So thanks everyone for joining us today. Filipino American Psychology, 2nd edition, out today. Check it out on wiley.com or amazon.com. Actually, you don't have to buy it on Amazon. Support local businesses and bookstores. And also, you can check out my website, kevinnadal.com, for more information. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a great night. Salamat.